Hi everyone, and welcome to Now and Men, the podcast about men, masculinities and gender equality. I'm Sandy Ruxton. I'm here with Stephen Burrell as usual. It feels like it's been quite a while since we last did an episode, Stephen, but hopefully some of you will have listened in the meantime to our conversation with Dr. Stacey Pope about football, which has been very topical here in England as we've been hosting the Women's Euros.
Hi Sandy, and hi everyone. Yes, without wishing to get all nationalistic about it, how amazing it's been to see England win the trophy, as Stacey did predict that they would. They played so well, and it's been such an exciting tournament all round, really. It's also been fantastic to see so many people watching and following the matches on television and going to the games. We've seen the attendance record for both women's and men's European Championships broken during the tournament. So let's hope that this really marks a real long-term step forward in terms of coverage, investment, attention towards the women's game at all levels, here in England, in the UK, and more broadly as well. But today we're changing tack a little bit, and we're focusing on prisons, which are of course predominantly populated by men. So 96% of prisoners here in the UK are men, but often perhaps the links between crime and masculinity aren't discussed or explored as much as they could be. So today we're talking to Dan Boyden, who does a lot of work with a charity called Safe Ground here in the UK.
And Safe Ground design and deliver arts-based programmes for people in prison and in the community. And Dan's the lead facilitator of their flagship programmes, Man Up and Family Man. He's also the director of an organisation called the Change Collective, which brings together creative practitioners seeking to use the arts as a tool for social change. I should state perhaps an interest here too, in that in a former life I worked with young offenders and prisoners for a number of charities, including Prison Reform Trust, NACRO, and as it then was, Community Service Volunteers. So I'm particularly interested in your experience, Dan, and what, if anything, has changed since I was more directly involved in the sort of 80s and 90s. I mean, one thing that I know is that the prison population those days was about 40,000. Now it's about double that. So you can take from that, obviously, that in some ways we've been going backwards, haven't we?
Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us today, Dan.
Thanks very much for inviting me on. It's really nice to meet you and really great to connect.
Thank you. So perhaps to start off with, could you tell us a little bit about these programmes that Safe Ground run and that you work on, called Man Up and Family Man? What is it that these programmes aim to do? I mean, I suppose the titles are quite interesting. I mean, for example, the term Man Up is often criticised for implying, that men should toughen up, not show weakness or ask for help. How do you use these terms and why?
It's a very good question. So Family Man is obviously a deliberately provocative title, and it is has got me into some interesting initial conversations with participants for sure. And both the programs that Safe Ground run are group work programs essentially, and it's about, I guess, bringing people together to share some of the ideas and the knowledge and the wisdom that is already in the room. It's a kind of facilitated group work program. And we create a space to be able to unpack, interrogate, explore, share ideas around what it is to be a man today and how this idea of masculinity impacts how we feel, how we connect with each other, how we think about our family and our friends and the people that are close to us. Why potentially some of this notion of what it is to be a man and some of the norms and expectations, whether that's social, cultural, have meant that men have ended up doing things that has ended up them being in prison. So Safe Ground are really interested in this idea of relationships and how to build and maintain healthy, supportive, good relationships for men inside. Between each other, but also, with their families and with the support structures, thinking, with this idea that if we develop the skills, the confidence, the ability to be able to maintain good, healthy relationships, then there's less risk that we might reoffend, or there's less chance that some of those ties that men have with the people that are in their lives will be broken. So it's a really powerful, very kind of robust methodology. It's arts-based, but loosely arts-based. My background is theatre. I'm a theatre practitioner. We use role play and we use theatre-based techniques in terms of using our bodies and creating images and telling stories and thinking about how we communicate, not necessarily only through the things that we say. But it's kind of light touch. We definitely don't do Shrek the Musical on day one, that's for sure. And there's a lot of discussions. There's a lot of trying to, I guess, create the conditions whereby men, the work that I do, say I work with women as well, but the work I do in Family Man and Fathers Inside and Man Up is around, I guess, creating the conditions within the group for men to be a bit vulnerable and for men to take down some of the armor that they have naturally built up inside an environment which is kind of hostile and heavy and is very is very toxic. Prisons aren't people don't feel safe. My assumption is that people don't feel safe, whether that's prisoners, the staff. So I think for me, the magic that can happen in those groups is that there is the sense of safety that is created, and there is a sense of being able to access a slightly different version of ourselves than we might normally do outside of those spaces. And yeah, there's not too many fancy tricks. It's interesting conversations. It's allowing people to be heard. It's listening. It's calling people out as well in a way that feels constructive and productive. Challenging people again in a way that is hopefully models useful ways of communicating and challenging and disagreeing with somebody. I think in prisons often that's not the case. It often results in violence and conflict, whereas some of those early activities and conversations are around what do we do in a group when somebody disagrees with me? What does that look like, and how do we work with that, and how do we not react in a way that we might have habitually reacted, which has maybe been less healthy? So yeah, the Man Up is an intensive six sessions, and often is delivered over 3 days. So you go in quite quick, quite hard, and there will often be somebody from the prison who is either kind of co-facilitating or in the room and part of the conversations, which I think is a really key component. And it's a whistle-stop tour in 15 hours of some of the biggies. We look at, identity, archetypes, power, anger, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And through these kind of practical activities, we're going deeper, kind of hour by hour, and moving towards some kind of presentation. And I think, again, that's a really key part of the methodology and the approach, is that actually the men have an opportunity at the end of these programs to be able to stand up and talk about the process and what's shifted, or how it's been, but to give, like I said, a kind of my key takeaway from the work is allowing those men to show a different side of themselves, and to kind of own some of their failures, own some of their things that they've struggled with, in an environment where it's really hard for men to do that. Family Man and Fathers Inside traditionally have been much longer. So I've run Fathers Inside over 8 weeks in Wandsworth, and that was with a group of men from the age of 18 up to 50 or 55, and I think what's interesting is that's explicitly looking at the role of a father and what that means, and again using kind of similar techniques and approaches that I've just talked about with Man Up, but kind of thinking really about this idea of that very specific role of a father and what that looks like for somebody who's inside and isn't able to be with their kids, and how they might move closer towards a better version of being a father than they have been. But again, as a facilitator in that process, I'm not coming with any specific ideas about what that looks like to either be a man or to be a father, but I am kind of, I guess, introducing ways that we might be able to look at it, and I'm kind of very much bringing myself as a person into that as well, which I think is really interesting. So yeah, it's great. I find it really energizing. I find it really different. Every time is different. Every time you bring a group of people together, it's totally different. The dynamics are different. The kind of peer support and the peer learning that happens in those rooms is amazing. Is quite incredible. And feels really important. The conversations feel important. The shifts feel important. The fact that there aren't those spaces in prison to be able to look at that, I think, is what I find most interesting or exciting about the work, for sure.
Yeah, can you tell us? Obviously, men in prison are quite a varied group. They'll be in there for all sorts of different reasons. They're, different age groups. So, yeah, could you tell us a little bit more about who the men are that you are working with? I mean, is it particularly any particular groups of men, any particular parts of the country, or particular types of prisons? Yeah.
Yeah, it really varies. Safe ground work in a lot of institutions, and have got relationships with some that we go back to, and there's often new prisons that we work in. A lot of my work has been with young offenders. So I've worked up in Brinsford in the West Midlands, and that I find that fascinating, and kind of in a way I find it more challenging sometimes than the work in the adult prison population. And I think it's partly because teenagers is a tricky time for anybody, and I think there's a huge amount of anger, and it feels much harder for them to be more authentic versions of themselves in those spaces, partly because they don't necessarily haven't had the life experience to be able to reflect on that, and also partly because I think that they're scared. They're kids, and that's, I hope that doesn't sound patronizing, but they are young kids who are often products of some real chaos in terms of their lives and their upbringing, and have made some bad choices along the way, but are just scared, and that fear, or that that whatever it is that they are feeling comes out in lots of kind of quite aggressive, unpredictable ways. So I think the young offender stuff can be really powerful, and there's an energy, but that you have to kind of work with. But the groups I've worked, like I said, in Brixton, and Wandsworth, and various places that there isn't a particular profile. It's really interesting that there is a real diversity of life experience. There is a real diversity of culture and identity, race and class, actually, as well. And I think that is what makes, again, the thing that I find interesting and challenging about the work is how you bring in that difference, how you work with those dynamics, and try to create an opportunity for them to share, to connect, to learn, and to be okay with that difference. I think it's much, I guess when the groups have more in common, it's probably easier to move quicker. But I think when there is a lot of difference in those rooms, initially people can feel like, I don't have anything to be able to share with that other person who lives a completely different life. But quite quickly, they create ways to be, which I think can be really transformative in terms of challenging some of those assumptions that they might have come into those spaces with. So yeah, it's mixed. I've also done some interesting work in Bethlehem Psychiatric Hospital, which was working with a small group, delivering Man Up, with a really small group of men who were all experiencing psychosis, had psychosis, and were experiencing hearing voices. And again, we didn't do that back to back. We extended that over 3 weeks. We thought about the other staff that were needed to be in the room, but the kind of core approach didn't shift that much, which again I think is testament to the way that Safeground have really understood the best way of doing, or not the best way, but an effective way of bringing men together, even in kind of settings which are really much higher risk, I guess. So yeah, interesting and challenging as a facilitator, but really kind of you really get a sense of the diversity and the reach of men across the UK when you're doing this kind of work. Yeah.
You mentioned there some of the challenges for facilitation. I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit more about that, really, because I can see that it is difficult to run these groups. There's different categories of prisoners and different issues are coming up, and also perhaps sometimes it's not safe for men to reveal information about themselves in a prison setting. So there's a tension in there, isn't there, between helping them to open up, but at the same time recognizing they are in a prison environment, and that can be very difficult. So I was just thinking there are challenges for facilitation. And do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think you're dead right, and I think that it's interesting. There are certain challenges that you sign up for as a facilitator in terms of the way in which that group is held, and being able to deal with some of the behaviour and the dynamics in the room. That's kind of what you sign up for. And then there's also all of the challenges of operating in a prison, and you're at the mercy of lockdowns. You're at the mercy of prisoners having very limited amounts of time to go and see the doctor or to have visits, or so you're kind of, it requires a real flexibility and adaptability in terms of being able to kind of manage expectations in terms of your own expectations about what's possible. I recently did a program in HMP Peterborough. It's a 3-day program, and the whole of the second day we couldn't do anything at all because of the lockdown in the morning, and then the prison system kind of playing catch up after having locked down the whole place. So yeah, you have to think on your feet, and you have to also, I guess, like you said, Sandy, be really conscious. I am always very conscious, I guess, of what can happen when actually we encourage people to access stuff that they might not necessarily be accessing day to day, and how then they've transitioned back into a world that hasn't had that kind of space, and is very different, often kind of the other end of the planet in terms of the way in which men are behaving towards each other. So I think that there's work that with the prison in terms of managing and supporting that transition, and making sure that people are kind of supported and checked in with afterwards. And then I think there's also a role that the group can play in terms of being able to continue the support and to being able to have those conversations on the wing that they might have had versions of in the workshop setting. I think that the level of transformation is in direct relationship to the danger that you could be in and the group could be in. So I think that there's a kind of trade-off of actually, I think a lot of interventions in prison don't necessarily go to the depths that Safe Ground does, and I think as a result they might not be as transformative or as impactful. But there's definitely scaffolding and ways of being able to support the group and individually people within the group to make sure that actually they're able to also process and carry with them some of what has come up from those sessions. I think it is interesting. I think that also the approach that we take, which is not necessarily just cerebral or just intellectual. We're working on a level which is kind of emotional, but we're also working with the body, and we're also working with that people naturally process things at different times and in different ways. So I think it's it feels kind of alive and electric, and as a result, it feels like we have a kind of duty of care as an organisation, as facilitators as well, to make sure that transition back into the prison environment is kind of done safely. Yeah,
because you said earlier that it was important that there was some involvement from the prison alongside you as facilitator. I think, I don't know if that's an officer or someone from psychology or education or whatever. It probably varies from prison to prison. But I'm wondering how that role works. Working with them, and presumably they have an important role in taking stuff into the wider prison as well. Because in an ideal world, your work would influence the prison as an institution. It wouldn't just be located amongst those few men that you're able to engage with. But I know that's idealistic, but presumably that's part of the point of running programs like this, is to try and change people's experience in prison as a whole.
Exactly, and I think that when I think about the successful examples of this kind of work, it's often been working with unexpected kind of allies within the prison. Often, people who might be kind of seconded to this particular workshop without knowing a huge amount about what it might be, but have been really valuable in terms of the conversations, also in terms of, I guess, a lot of the work is rooted in this idea of empathy and understanding, and trying to go beneath some of the identities that people are carrying around in those prisons. So if I think for the prison officers as well, to be able to kind of sit in a space, and it's often male prison officers, or support workers, not always actually, but often it's an all male group. And I think to be able to have that lens, to be able to bring in that experience of what it is like to be a prison officer, to be able to also allow some of the men, the prisoners, to be able to see slightly different versions of their staff, I think is also really, really important. And that final presentation, the mission, the aim is to always try to get as many of the kind of senior managers, the governors, the traditional power holders, I guess, within those spaces, to also come and be part of that, to come and experience that, to come and see it, to come and feel the energy of those final performances. And I think that is where, I think you're right, I think that is where the impact travels. And I think there's an interesting dynamic that can happen, because one argument is that what we're doing is showing a slightly different version of what's possible for these young men. And actually, it's very difficult sometimes, I think, for those prison officers or for the governors or for the culture that system is built on, also needs in some way to reinforce the idea that prisoners are in there and they need to be punished. So actually, it's an approach which is kind of in tension or in opposition to a lot of the way in which those prisons are run. And that's a bigger political conversation as well. But I think on a human level, it can be there's interesting conversations that I've had with the guards or with the managers, the governors, the people who commission the work, I guess. Because in a way, it's easier for them not always to see that human side, or not always see the dad who is struggling, or the uncle who is sorry for the mistake. It's kind of easier in a way to be able to kind of slightly dehumanize. So there's an interesting tension and dynamic sometimes with this kind of work, but I can imagine there will be interesting conversations as well around where does this program sit within an institution that has a particular culture, and how does it really embed itself? And I think there is examples of it happening really successfully. I'm working in Peterborough. We're going to be working over the winter. We're going to be delivering 6 man-up sessions over 6 months, and I think that is often down to people really seeing the benefit, but also the decision makers within the prisons not feeling threatened about what might come up from this kind of work. And I think that's probably to do with personalities, and as much as and the building of relationships with people who see the value and the benefit of this kind of work, and also understand where it could fit within the prison. So it's interesting.
I was interested in what you said there about punishment, because I was reminded of that dictum that prisoners go to prison as punishment, not for punishment, and it strikes me as really important to hold on to that, actually. And yet, in a world where punishment has become much more sort of pervasive, and ideals of rehabilitation have been seriously challenged, it's difficult to hold on to that notion that we're not there to punish, but the punishment is being in prison, in fact. I guess there's a whole challenge for rehabilitation programs of all kinds within this context.
I think that's it, and I think that there's. I was struck, and I won't sort of name the prison, but there was a prison that I worked in, and it was pre-COVID, pre-lockdown, which I think has definitely heightened and exacerbated all of those tensions that you're talking about. But it was most of the young men. It was the young offenders. Most of the young men, for most of the time, were locked up for kind of 22 and a half, 23 hours a day. And so it's kind of like, where do you start with that? If that's the conditions that they're operating in, what hope do you have to be able to support somebody to make a set of different choices at any point in the future? People, those young guys, as I said at the beginning, are kind of slightly lost and scared, and then locked in a room for 23 hours a day, often either on their own or somebody that they've never met. and then there's an expectation that at the end of that 6 months or year or 3 years, they will be able to then re-engage with the world again. And it's just a thankless, impossible task. And I think that, looping it back into this idea of masculinity, I think that there's so much anger that brews, and I think that there's so much resentment that of that way of being treated that makes young men particularly act in really volatile, aggressive, often violent ways. And I think, I guess, looking at it from an outsider, of course that's going to happen. If you put somebody through such a restrictive regime, and for me, that's kind of to be able to come out the other end of it, anything other than really angry and resentful, I think would almost be impossible.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned before, Dan, about how part of the work you do involves the use of these kind of arts-based methods, and that's obviously something which you're passionate about more broadly in the work you do as well, I guess. So yeah, I mean, I think we're just interested really in why do you use those methods? Why do you think that they are kind of effective and powerful, and how do the kind of participants respond to them? I mean, is there some reluctance at first to engage with those kinds of methods? I mean, and I was also wondering, I guess, do the men volunteer to take part in the programs you're doing?
Often they do. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes the incentive of 5 hours outside of yourself is enough to get them to sign. It could have been a crochet or French. So I think that they are there because they're curious as well. And I think that they have relationships with staff in the prison who might suggest that this is an interesting space for you just to try and give it a go. And I always start with conversations around comfort zone and expectations, and the fact that for some guys, just being in that space in a circle with other men is massively outside of your comfort zone. For some people, this idea of group work and is much more familiar. So they're coming in at very different levels, and they're coming in at very different stages of their own journey in terms of rehabilitation and prison experiences. I think in terms of the arts-based or the practical approach, I think it speaks to this idea that we learn and communicate in very different ways, and there is an ability to connect with this. I would never say that it was playing. I wouldn't say the word play, but there's something which is playful about the approach, and something which is creative about the approach, and something which I think allows them to not necessarily just be in their head. I think they spend a huge amount of time in their head, and I think that the more that they can do to move, the more that they can do to connect in a kind of kinesthetic way, I think is really useful. And it kind of catches people off guard. I think, it can seem like the activities and the exercises that we're doing are games, and actually the kind of learning and the shifts and the discoveries happen in the debrief and happen in the questions that we're asking, and the ability for them to be able to reflect on the experience that they've just had and then talk about it and share it with other people who have also shared that experience. So I think for me, I do a lot of work with Theatre of the Oppressed, Augusto Boal, and his idea, he uses a lot of image theatre. And again, a lot of the safe ground work, I think, it draws on this idea of images and role play and how we tell stories and connect without necessarily having to sit around the table and talk about it. And what I've found is that one of his taglines is that theatre itself is not the revolution, but it's the rehearsal for the revolution. So I think what we're doing in those sessions, and the more practical, the more on your feet, the more kind of interactive and creative you're being, is that you're practicing, and you're practicing exploring different ways of thinking and different ways of being, and in a space that allows you to try something and then not try it again, or to fail, and that's okay to fail, or to have fun and for that to be okay. So that there's something about, I think, again, what's created in those workshops through the methodology that Safe Ground use is that we are practicing, we are rehearsing or different ways of being. And that is powerful, I think, because we're learning through the practical, through the role play, through the drama, through the games. We're also seeing how other people are doing it. So that there's this kind of, I guess, symbiotic relationship that happens between the men of, okay, this is what I'm seeing over here, and this is also helping me inhabit or be a slightly different version of myself without any, not without any, but with low risk. So that there's, I think that probably that's the skill of the facilitator, to be able to create that, and also to be able to model some of that. So I think it's again a big distinction between maybe teaching or training and facilitating, is this idea of kind of walking the walk with them. And that's a really interesting set of choices, I think, as a facilitator, because the traditional way of prison guards talking to prisoners is they don't reveal anything. And there's lots of training around that, and I can totally see why that's important. I think we're coming in, and the decisions that I make are quite early on are about trying to also show up and be a bit vulnerable and model some of the behaviours and the ways of being that I'm encouraging people to do. But yeah, that's an interesting moment at the beginning, and I think some of those games and some of the practical and some of the more arts-based approaches help that. They help to create the energy, but they also help to create a space that feels as equal as it can do in that environment. And of course, there are lines that we all have as facilitators, and parameters and boundaries that we need to kind of maintain to keep people safe, I think, in that. But yeah, it's really interesting. I'm a dad, and I was just about to become a dad, actually, for the first time when I did the Wandsworth gig, the 8-week, and it was really beautiful to see some of the fathers who were inside taking on the kind of role of mentor and of sort of coach for me as a slightly nervous man about to become a dad. But actually in terms of the power, there was an interesting kind of shift because of that, and which I think was also really useful for the conversations that we were having, and useful for the group, and useful for the program as a whole, to be able to kind of meet somewhere in the middle and have the conversations there, rather than asking them to have the conversations and not being prepared to yourself, or not showing that you're also willing to be a bit vulnerable yourself. So it was really great. I also had a moment where I got my moped stolen, and I shared that with them, and suddenly you could see all the shoulders kind of prick up, and they said, "Well, where was it? Give me 2 hours, and I'll find out." So there was a really kind of that. And again, that's my assumption. I've not been in those sessions, but I think it's much harder probably to get to create that when you're not approaching it in a way that feels open and creative and practical. So it's not without its challenges, for sure, but I think that ability to be able to play together, whatever that means for people, I think is really powerful. Yeah.
No, it's interesting as well that you mentioned about fatherhood there, because I mean, I suppose obviously a lot of men in prison are fathers, and of course that can be a really big and upsetting thing for them to experience, I suppose, being taken away from their families and their children. And for many of them, there might be fathers at quite a young age as well, and may feel kind of shame and guilt about being absent from the lives of their children as they grow up. And I suppose some may have treated their children badly, or their partners badly, for example. So how do you engage with the men around those kinds of issues? And do you find that to be quite a big motivational factor in kind of wanting to change as well among the men that you speak to?
Yeah, I think the program goes right for the big archetypes really quite quickly, in terms of those kind of male archetypes that we have a connection with. We all have connections with on some level, whether it's that we are fathers, or we have had fathers, or we are uncles or brothers, and I think what it does is we quite quickly explore the complexity of those roles. So what does what does it mean to be that? What does it, what enables us to be good versions of those particular archetypes? And also, how do we feel when, as you said, Stephen, this idea of shame and guilt, and ultimately they are all unable to be the fathers probably that they think that they should be, or that they imagine that they might have been, because they're locked up in a prison. So we go there quite explicitly, and I think that can be quite hard, and I think that can be quite challenging. But I think it's part of the whole package. It's part of this idea of it's a space to be able to own some of those failures and insecurities, and also to practically to be able to really ask those difficult questions about what's it going to take for them to be different versions. What's it going to really take for them to be a better dad when they step out of the workshop or they step out of the prison? And I think that kind of challenge or that way of holding people accountable is again, I think is something that differentiates the program. I think we go there, and I think that is supportive, because we're collectively and individually strategizing for ways of doing things differently. And then we're also not giving people the option of just giving us an answer and then parking it. I think it's really about sharing our experiences of what it has been to be a father, if we're talking about being a father, and then using each other as a kind of resource to be able to practically, tangibly think about how to be better versions than we have been. And I think with that comes all of the conversations around Maslow and needs, and how what has been coming underneath, the feelings that we've been experiencing underneath some of the behavior that we've been showing, some of those traditional ideas around what do we expect a father to be, or what's been our experience of our own fathers? What are some of the external influences that have shaped how we've seen ourselves as dads? Whether that's media, film, there's kind of interesting. It feels like it's a 360 exploration of not just necessarily one particular role or one experience of that, but multiple versions of what it is to be a dad. And then there's something around challenging people safely and constructively to be able to think about how they use that intelligence or use that data to be able to behave differently. And I think it's as much about mindset shifting as it is about trying to kind of influence how people behave. And I think, again, like I said at the beginning, I think once you unpack it and once the armor comes down, people feel very ashamed about not being able to fulfill their role as a dad. And I think the challenge, as always, as we've talked about, is what happens after the workshop, or what happens back on the wing, or what happens when they leave and go back to the community. It's kind of thinking about how do they apply some of the things that they might have discovered during those workshops.
Yeah, and could you tell us a little bit, Dan, about what impact the work has on the men involved in it? I mean, what kinds of changes have you seen among them? Do you find that it is possible to shift, some of the really kind of rigid, hard constructions of masculinity that I suppose men are often expected to kind of live up to in prison? I mean, do you have any examples which come to mind of individuals that you have really seen kind of change in positive ways?
I think it's about being realistic about what's possible in those short spaces of time. I think that some of those behaviours and ways of thinking are really entrenched. So I think we're not for a second trying to say that there's a kind of the magic wand, but I think it's I think that there's constantly examples of the journey that men travel, even in 15 hours. Take Man Up, for example, to be able to kind of stand up on stage and talk very honestly and eloquently about and kind of really reflect, I guess, on the things that are shifting, and also reflect on how it has been to go through this process. So I think that that's useful and impactful on an individual level. I think that there's also something the power and potential of the people who are coming from the prison to be able to hear that, I think, adds another layer of potential impact. And I think that there's going back to some of those prisons, you can see, you have a sense of some of the impact that it's had on culture, on the culture of the prison, and the way in which, I guess, interventions are run, so that there's, I think for some prisons, this kind of semi-therapeutic approach is new. And I think there's often, when you go back sometimes to institutions, you can see that people are more open to working in those kind of ways. I think it happens on layers, and I think that it also kind of, I'm interested in thinking about the kind of semi sort of longitudinal studies, and thinking about what happens when we go back in 6 months' time or in a year's time. And ideally, some of them, they won't be there. A lot of people will be out in the community. It does become much harder to kind of to follow those stories and to follow those individuals. So, but I think, for instance, the Peterborough work that is coming up this winter, we're working with young men. I think within the prison population, there's 250 young men across the prison, and we'll have worked with nearly half of them, a third. And so there's something as well about what can happen. It's that kind of tipping point, I guess. What can happen, or what could happen, when more young men in a prison have done Man Up than haven't. I think, again, it allows people to feel like they can start those conversations at a slightly deeper point, or they can begin those conversations in a way that they might not have done before. There are those kind of shared reference points. So yeah, I think it's a constantly interesting topic around evaluation, and in terms of kind of monitoring that impact at those different levels. But I guess what I'm seeing is from a kind of human sort of narrative story based way of measuring it. It feels like there's huge change, and it feels like there's a kind of I think an opportunity also to think about what role people who have been through the program might then have in future versions of delivery. We did the recent work in Peterborough. We did 3 weeks back to back, and at the end of our week, we had 2 or 3 of them who wanted to become mentors and come back and support the delivery for the following week. So again, that may seem like a really small thing, but I think for those 3 guys who had been through the program to feel confident enough to slightly move into the role as kind of mentor or of kind of assistant facilitator, that's an interesting journey. And I think that then the kind of cascade of kind of that learning, I guess, happens in ways that I think is very difficult to track and to monitor. But yeah, there's definitely lots of stories and examples of people seeing the benefit and the shift in terms of how people are interacting and behaving with each other. Yeah.
I mean, listening to the brilliant programs that you're running, it just strikes me as kind of ironic that, a man goes to prison and then gets access to this kind of intervention, when actually the kinds of programs you talk about would be so relevant in the wider community, in schools, and so on and so forth, and yet it's just this very limited opportunity that's there to engage. There's a real contradiction there, isn't there?
Yeah, it is. And I think I've started working in Croydon, in Croydon probation, which again is an interesting kind of space, because all the guys are free to leave. They can leave whenever they want, and they don't necessarily need to be there in the first place. So I think there's interesting, in the prison they're there. They're probably not going to be anywhere else unless they've escaped brilliantly from prison. Out in the community, it feels like a very different kind of gig, and yet what we're seeing is the retention of those participants. The people are staying exactly because of that, Sandy. That I think that it's very hard for men to have the kind of conversations traditionally that we would be having in Man Up, and yet I think we need to have them more and more, and we need to have them in really different contexts and different places. And I think I'd be interested in I guess exploring what needs to shift in the model or what needs to shift in the approach when actually you work in different contexts. So actually, I think that traditional workshop-based kind of group work format is really great when you know where they're going to be. I think there's interesting other techniques and tools that you can use potentially to engage and to meet men closer to where they are, figuratively, I guess. So there's I think it's interesting to think about again in the facilitator's toolbox. What tools do you have to also be able to kind of enable and support these conversations between men to happen in ways that don't necessarily require them to sign up to a 3-day workshop. Because I think again it can be quite it's an easier thing to say no to those kind of things than to say yes. And I think I wonder what those conversations are. There's a brilliant writer called Inor Ellams. I don't know if you know Inor Ellams, and he's well worth checking out. And he recognized that the barbershop is where men talk. And I think that those kind of ideas and interventions of like, okay, what are the places that men are meeting and congregating, and how do we slightly engineer or tweak those conversations to be able to feel like there is a depth to them and there is an ability for them to also do the things that I've talked about in terms of those men in prison without shoehorning it. And I think that that's really tricky because it is easier to have the conversations that don't go to that depth. But as we know, the real discoveries and kind of movement happens, I think, when we are able to be more vulnerable and more authentic than we might normally be as men in all male spaces.
Sure. I wanted to ask you, what kind of impact does doing this work have on you personally? Because I mean, it must be pretty tough, and you must get a whole load of ordure coming through, that you have to somehow process yourself. And how do you feel about working, in such circumstances, and how do you manage?
It definitely is. There's an intensity to it, and I think that there is, because you show up and you're prepared to also be part of those conversations. It definitely has an impact, and I think there's something as well interesting as a facilitator and as a professional. Also, how do you transition? How do you yourself move back into a world that hasn't had those conversations? And we have clinical supervision, and often with those kind of spaces, you go in not thinking that you've got anything to talk about or to share, and then within 5 minutes you realize that of course, the kind of weight of holding, I guess, trying to forage and uncover some of these stories and then holding these stories also has an impact. And I think that's, we will always have a co-facilitator. So whether that's somebody from the prison or somebody else from within the SafeGround pool or from the SafeGround team, and I think that role of co-facilitation is key in the space, is really important. And also at the kind of 7:00 buffet breakfast planning sessions at the Travel Lodge, or the kind of 8 p.m. debrief, to be able to have space to also go through that reflective practice yourself is key. And I think, I guess I've been facilitating for a while and in different contexts to kind of clock and recognize when I need it, and try to kind of make sure that I embed that reflective practice I prioritize it as much as the delivery in the workshop room, because I think then as a facilitator, all you've got as a resource is yourself. And actually, if you don't look after yourself as a human, then you're not also going to be a good facilitator. And I think that you're not going to be able to sustain the kind of work that you do. And I think again, it's being in those sessions, it's hearing that the stories, but it's also just operating in a prison. It's kind of I'm always amazed how I feel coming out of the prison, and the locked doors, and the kind of just the institutional nature of these places, even after 3 days, is quite amazing. And then I think about, okay, if someone's been in prison for 4 years, 5 years, and then coming out the other side of that. So there's definitely something about the environment and the context and the work and all of that needs to go somewhere. And I think that's a combination of those more formal kind of clinical supervision spaces and the informal check-in, check-out with your co-facilitator, and going and playing football on a Tuesday night and not thinking about a prison, So there's a kind of, it feels like not always, but it feels like I'm kind of aware of the things that I need to do to be able to stay on top of it. Yeah.
I was also just wondering, Dan, given what you were saying about, if that men in the wider community are not really encouraged often to reflect on the things you've been talking about in terms of masculinity, let alone men in prison, how did you, just lastly, how did you first get involved in thinking about these issues about, what it means to be a man and the pressures and expectations there?
Yeah, that's quite a question to finish with. I mean, that could be a
Sorry,
that could be that could be a podcast.
Would you come on next week as well?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's always about your own experiences. My experiences growing up, my experiences with men in my life, my journey around what I think it is to be a man, or the kind of version of a man that I feel able to be. There's an interest in, I guess, at the heart of it, I've always been interested in what happens when people come together and connect, and that, I guess, the alchemy of what happens when people come together. And I think, that's why I like going to festivals, or that's why I like doing lots of things. But there's also something very specific around, these things aren't going to go away for men, and particularly there's these questions of identity and the weight of carrying other people's expectations and judgments about what it is to be a man, and the external idea and the notion of those social expectations and cultural expectations. But it definitely does feel like there's something that unites all this work I do, and something that excites me just generally about bringing people together to be able to find out a bit more about themselves and about other people.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Dan. That was so interesting to talk to you. It's been a real pleasure to hear about the great work you're doing. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I feel so sort of glad that you do what you do. I mean, just, thank God. And I wish there could be more of it. So thanks so much for talking to us today. It was really, really
thank
great.
you. Thanks for having me on. And I look forward to kind of hearing more of your podcast, because I think what you're doing in terms of this kind of conversation and kind of amplifying that is really great. So thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Well, what an interesting conversation that was with Dan, and hearing about the great work that Safe Ground are doing. What did you make of the conversation, Sandy?
Yeah, that was great, wasn't it? I really identified with and remember what Dan was saying about the whole atmosphere and environment of a prison. When you arrive at the gate, and the endless security, being escorted between different buildings and blocks, jangling of keys, the smell, the noise, bright lights, the extremes of hot and cold, not to mention what he also talked about, which was, lockdowns constantly. I mean, the difficulties of working in an institution like that. These are very severe. So it's amazing that they managed to do the work, really. But there's a couple of other things that occurred to me. One was, and I don't think we asked him about this, he mentioned, if they're co-running, co-facilitating groups, I think that does change the nature of the groups. So if they then become mixed gender groups, and I think there's interesting issues around all male groups when you are a facilitator, and the difficulty of both, engaging but also not colluding with some of the things that men might say. For example, some of the banter, perhaps, negative comments about women or something like that. And actually, sometimes in group work like that, it's very useful to have a female voice or a female take and challenge. And it sounded like, from what he was saying, as if that is the kind of thing that Safe Ground provides. So I kind of wish we'd asked him about that, but I think there is an issue in there. But the other thing I wanted to talk about was the structure of the prison and how difficult it is to make change within the sort of penal setting. I did ask him about this, and I think he gave the impression that there was some impact on the system as a whole. But I remember my own experience. I mean, I worked for community service volunteers for a few years, and what we did was we took young offenders at the last part of their sentence out of the prison for the last month of their sentence and placed them in community work, be that working with disabled people or an old people's home or youth groups or whatever. And that was quite we took some risks there with that program, but there were many young people who were massively successful, and it just showed the outside world, but also those prisoners, a different version of themselves, which is kind of reflecting some of what Dan was saying as well about getting a different take on your own identity, if you like. But that sort of program doesn't exist now, as far as I'm aware, and it probably wouldn't exist because of increasing security concerns and the need for offence checking and all this sort of stuff as well. So, it feels like the prison service wouldn't take what they would consider to be a risk like that in the current circumstance. And so I suppose my point is that actually, in many ways, we may have gone backwards in terms of how prisons are now organised and run. And, perhaps a more defensive, probably more punitive culture holding sway. And I'm also thinking now of some of the work that I used to do in the 1980s, 90s, which was about community alternatives to prison, getting young people out of prison, so that they don't get there in the first place, but by using cautioning, by using diversion techniques, by running groups in the community, and some of that drew on US experience, led by people like Jerome Miller in Massachusetts, who closed 2 of the main juvenile correctional facilities in the belief that community alternatives would grow up and would actually be able to hold and contain some of the most difficult young people in the community. And I feel sad in some ways that I feel we've lost some of that reforming culture and zeal that used to be there. I mean, I'm so glad, as I said, that Dan and others do the kinds of work they do, and it's obviously important, and it's a space where you can actually engage with some men, but the system as a whole does make for some huge difficulties in making change. What did you think? Sorry, I wittered there.
No, those are all brilliant points, Andy, and I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, I think the point you made right at the beginning about how many people are now being sent to prison. I think in the UK, we send more people to prison than most other countries in Europe, for example, don't we? And you kind of have to wonder, like, why? Why are we doing that? Because it seems to me, based on what Dan was saying, often it doesn't actually work, right? If we're talking about trying to change people's behaviour, if we're talking about trying to stop crime, stop people from being harmed, sending them to prison, especially when we think about masculinity, because often the prison environment, is very brutalizing. It's very harsh. It's reinforcing, very rigid, restrictive ideas about masculinity. Men are having to kind of live up to those expectations often just to survive in the prison context. And actually, the criminal justice system is often reinforcing those kinds of expectations as well, right? That it's forcing men to be in the kind of situations where they feel like the only way that they can be a man is to be that kind of tough, unemotional guy. For me, I do come back to thinking, what else could we be doing to try and change these ideas about masculinity, with men who might have committed crimes, where actually, maybe prison isn't the best option for a lot of them. But also, what more could we be doing as well? What we were talking about with Dan in terms of preventative work, so that these kinds of crimes never happen in the first place, and that there's never a need, for these institutions to exist in the first place. If we were doing more of the kind of work Safe Ground are doing in a preventative sense, with men across society, I guess.
Yes, I completely agree with what you just said, Stephen. It's clear that there's huge changes needed. But I think that's probably it for this episode, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. But thank you so much, everybody, for listening. And hopefully we'll talk to you again with another episode soon. Do get in touch with us at nowamen@gmail.com if you have any questions you'd like us to discuss, or comments or feedback. And do subscribe and share the podcast with your friends. And but yeah, thank you so much for listening. Take care and speak to you again soon.
Yeah, bye for now.
Bye.